Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 831, and today is August 25th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Lots of news to get through on today's show, so I'm going to jump right into it. Just a quick reminder to check out the Kyle Anzalone show. Today at 4:45 Eastern Time, I will be interviewing our good friend Dave DeCamp on all the things happening around the world, the wars that Trump wants to get us into, and just how optimistic we should be about the chances of ending the war in Ukraine. So let's jump into it, starting off today with this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on August 24th. Pentagon prepares special ops forces for operations against cartels. U.S. Special Operations Command North, SOC North, is preparing for for operations against Latin American cartels that could include raids in Mexico or other foreign countries. President Donald Trump wants the Pentagon to be prepared to conduct bombings, drone strikes, and raids in Mexico by mid-September. Glenn Klippenstein and William Arkin reported on Friday reviewing internal Department of Defense documents that show SOC North is directed to fight the cartels in the same way the U.S. military has fought terrorists in Middle East for the last 2 decades. SOC North has dedicated about half of its 300 personnel to anti-cartel operations. In a separate article by Klippenstein, he explains that the Pentagon will be prepared to conduct attacks in Mexico next month. He wrote, the Trump administration has directed the military to prepare for lethal strikes against cartel targets inside Mexico. The top secret planning order issued in late spring directs North Command, Northcom, to manage the attack plans, which are to be ready by mid-September. President Claudia Sheinbaum has rejected any U.S. military operations in Mexico. She said, "We will never put our sovereignty at risk. We will never put Mexico's independence at risk. Mexico is a free, sovereign, independent country. We collaborate, we coordinate on security matters and others, but we never subordinate ourselves, and we will never allow the U.S. Army or any other institution of the U.S. to set foot in Mexican territory ever." After President Donald Trump returned to the White House, his administration began listing Latin American cartels as terror groups. Then, President Trump authorized the military to attack those gangs even on foreign soil. The U.S. has also deployed 3 guided missile destroyers and an attack submarine to the South Caribbean Sea near Venezuela. The Trump administration has also listed Venezuelan cartels as terror groups, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio claims President Nicolas Maduro is the leader of Cartel de los Soles, and as we talked about in last show, likely doesn't even exist. And there's quite a bit of detail in that from a new article that I wrote with Will Porter, published at antiwar.com. It'll be up at the Institute sometime this week, also discussing potential military operations in Venezuela and the non-existence of Cartel de los Soles. So Maduro views the warships off Venezuela's coast as a threat and mobilized millions of militia troops in response. And so here it looks like we could be within maybe months of wars in Latin America, either with Mexico or with Venezuela. Now, with Mexico, I do think the government would really try to avoid any direct confrontation with the U.S. troops and would maybe try to resolve this with a bilateral agreement and maybe even allow the U.S. to conduct a few drone strikes in Mexico, or to allow the U.S. to plan the strikes and then maybe have them conducted by the Mexican military or something like that, where they're hitting the targets that we want. I could see with Mexico working it out. Mexico is the U.S.'s largest trading partner, and certainly this is something that Ted Galen Carpenter wrote about at the beginning of the Trump administration when Trump was first threatening to intervene in Latin America. I imagine this is probably mostly true of the Mexican cartels, but even cartels throughout Latin America. They have the ability not only to target Americans in Latin America, but also certainly have, through their drug distribution networks, contacts and assets in the United States of America already. And so if we start carrying out drone strikes, then bombings and things like that in the United States would not be impossible. This is something that happened in Colombia when they were really trying to crack down on the cartels. There was bombings of buildings and airplanes. And so I think this should be a heightened concern for all Americans, that Trump is going to embroil us in a winless war against the cartels that is going to have unprecedented blowback in the United States. All right, moving on here. This article, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, August 21st. Zelensky wants Western security guarantees before meeting with Putin. And so Zelensky is asking for more clarity on what security guarantees his Western backers are willing to provide before meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He said, "We want to have an understanding of the security guarantee architecture within 7 to 10 days. We need to understand which countries would be willing to do what at what specific moment." And so the problem with these security guarantees isn't necessarily, I mean, I imagine that one of the concessions that Russia will have to make to end the war will be at least some countries providing some security guarantees to Ukraine. Now, this could be as expansive as Western troops putting are Western countries putting their troops in Ukraine, American providing air support for the Ukrainians, or it could mean that, Germany and Poland and a few other European countries tell the Ukrainians, if Russia attacks again, we will help out, which, of course, they did that the first time Russia attacked. And also, this was what the Budapest Memorandum was in 1994, that Ukraine got security guarantees from the West, which obviously didn't amount to an Article 5 style agreement where we directly enter the conflict on behalf of the Ukrainians. And so certainly anything that stops short of direct Western support for Ukraine may be something the Russians are at least willing to consider. And so Dave also has an article here kind of detailing Putin's conditions for peace. Ukraine gives up Donbass, no NATO, no Western troops. And so, this is really, I think, driving the point home that maybe Russia would be open to some security guarantees, but they certainly can't be labeled as Article 5 style guarantees. They can't include Western troops in Ukraine. Ukraine will have to make the territorial concessions. And so I don't think a deal is going to get done here. I talked about this last week with James Carden on the Kyle Anzalone show. Highly recommend you check out that episode if you haven't done so already. And one of the things that, James really explains is that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are working against this deal. And if they don't want the deal, then it's not going to happen. Now, the war in Ukraine continues to escalate, even with some preliminary peace talks going on. Ukraine attacks Russian nuclear power plant. I wrote this one for the Institute on August 24th. Ukrainian forces hit a Russian nuclear power plant, causing a fire that was quickly extinguished. Ukrainian President Zelensky claims Ukraine is conducting long-range strikes in Russia without American assistance. Russian officials claim a Ukrainian drone was down near the Kursk nuclear power plant on Sunday, causing a small fire at the facility. The fire resulted in the NPP, that's the Kursk nuclear power plant, reducing the capacity of one of its 3 units by 50%. The International Nuclear Watchdog, that's the IAEA, reports that there were no injuries or an increase of radiation levels. The IAEA chief, Rafael Moreno Grassi, stressed that every nuclear facility must be protected at all times. The nuclear power plant is one of the largest in Russia. The NPP is located in Russia's Kursk region. Last year, Ukraine seized portions of Kursk but failed to capture the NPP. Over several months, Russian forces drove Ukrainians out of Kursk with some assistance from North Korean soldiers. Ukraine has stepped up attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. Last week, Ukraine attacked the pipeline in Russia that halted petroleum deliveries to Hungary. Budapest criticized Kiev for the attack and threatened to end energy transfers to Ukraine if Ukraine continued to target the pipeline. The Wall Street Journal reported on Saturday that the Pentagon ended support for Ukrainian strikes against Russia with American weapons. President Zelensky says Ukraine is now conducting attacks in Russia without U.S. support. Now, I imagine there's a pretty big asterisk on that. Even the Ukrainian ability to produce long-range drones and then fire them into Russia certainly has had a significant amount of CIA help, American funding, European funding, all behind that. But additionally, and the most important part would be the long range weaponry, right? This is what the or not the long range weaponry, excuse me, the intelligence is what they would probably need from the US to carry out these attacks, essentially no matter what. So moving on now to this article that I wrote for JudgeNap.com on August 24th. U.S. approves sale of thousands of missiles to Ukraine. President Donald Trump approved the sale of over 3,000 air-launched missiles to Ukraine. European nations will cover most of the cost of the arms. The Wall Street Journal reports it spoke with U.S. officials who said the White House approved the sale of 3,350 extended range air-launched cruise missiles, or ERAMs, to Ukraine. The munitions will cost $850 million, which Europe is expected to pay for. The ERAMs have a range of 150 to 280 miles and are expected to begin arriving in Ukraine within 6 weeks. President Donald Trump delayed the announcement of the sale to avoid interfering with the summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. The report follows a Trump post on Truth Social calling for Ukrainians to go on offense against Russia. He said it's very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invading country. It's like a great team in sports that had a fantastic defense but is not allowed to play offense. There's no chance of winning. The president went on to attack his predecessor for limiting Ukrainian attacks inside of Russia. He wrote, it is like that with Ukraine and Russia. Crooked and grossly incompetent Joe Biden would not let Ukraine fight back, only defend. How did that work out? Near the end of the Biden presidency, he authorized Ukraine to conduct strikes with long-range American ATACMS missiles to attack Russia. At the time, Trump criticized Biden's approval as dangerous. The Wall Street Journal reported that Trump revoked that authorization. The previously unreported decision to prevent Ukraine from using ATACMS was made in the spring. And so Trump just doesn't understand. I mean, that's the biggest concern I have with Donald Trump, is he never seems to really understand these issues that he's dealing with. And he goes at them in such a unrestrained manner, and yet has little to no information about what he's actually dealing with, or how can you end the war if you don't even understand how it fought it or why it's been fought the way it has. Next up, Ukrainian accused of coordinating bombing of Nord Stream pipelines arrested in Italy. A Ukrainian man who is accused of setting up the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline in 2022 was arrested in Italy. The bombing destroyed 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines that brought energy from Russia to Germany. The man, only identified as Serhiy K, was arrested in Italy after Germany issued a warrant for his arrest on Monday. A statement from the German prosecutor said he was a part of the team that destroyed the pipelines. Serhiy K was a part of a group of individuals who placed explosives on the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines near the island of Bornholm in September of 2022. The accused was allegedly one of the coordinators of the operation. He and his accomplices used a sailing yacht departing from Rostock for the transport. The yacht had previously been rented from a German company through intermediaries using forged identification documents. Multiple sources have offered different theories for who destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline. That was a statement, by the way, from the German prosecutor's office. So Western governments and media initially blamed Russia for destroying the pipelines. However, the explanation lacked a motive, as the Russian state oil firm Gazprom was the majority owner of the pipelines. Then Western governments dropped the accusation against Moscow and claimed a group of Ukrainians carried out the attack. Russian officials have rejected the results of the investigation led by Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. And of course, the Germans are pointing the finger at the Ukrainians. Russian ambassador to Germany, Sergei Neshkev, responded to the arrest of Shurhi by calling for an independent investigation. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov insisted that the U.S. played some role in the attack. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, speaking with sources who alleged that President Joe Biden directed the bombing, Hersh pointed to threats from President Joe Biden and former State Department official Victoria Nuland that the U.S. would take action against the Nord Stream pipeline if Russia invaded Ukraine as Washington's motives for carrying out the attack. And so I've always been somewhat skeptical that the U.S. was involved. I've definitely warmed up to that idea over time. I think this whole idea that Ukrainians on a yacht did it seems fairly thin, and I don't buy it. So I think this is a cover-up. I'm not sure. These Ukrainians may have been doing some illegal smuggling or something like that, and they're going to end up taking the fall for whatever Western government, whether it was Kiev, Washington, Brussels, London, that destroyed the pipelines, or a combination of all of those. Quick story on Korea here before we move into the Middle East. South Korean soldiers fire warning shots near North Korean troops. Pyongyang warns of uncontrollable escalation. Tensions on the Korean peninsula are spiking as South Korean troops fired on North Korean soldiers near the demilitarized zone. The friction between Pyongyang, Seoul, and Washington has escalated due to large-scale U.S. and South Korean war games. Seoul claimed on Saturday that its forces had fired on North Korean soldiers who crossed the DMZ. Pyongyang strongly condemned the South Korean soldiers' actions. A North Korean official explained that Pyongyang informed Washington its troops would be operating near the border to avoid a misunderstanding. They said they were erecting new barriers to prevent a South Korean attack into North Korea, and this is a reflection of North Korea's new policy of no longer trying unification with South Korea. Kim Jong-cho, the Army Lieutenant General and Vice Chief of the General Staff of the Korean People's Army, said on August 19th, the South Korean military warmongers committed such a serious provocation as firing more than 10 warning shots with 12.7 millimeter large caliber machine gun at the North Korean soldiers who were conducting a permanent barrier project near the southern borderline. This is a very serious prelude that would inevitably drive the situation in the southern border area, where a huge number of forces are stationing in confrontation with each other, to the uncontrollable phase of the North Korean army is keeping tabs on the present situation. The warning shots were fired as U.S. and South Korean forces are conducting large-scale live-fire war games. The military drills are running for 11 days and involve 21,000 soldiers. Pyongyang slammed the war games as extremely provocative. This is a statement from a North Korean spokesman. The joint military drills being staged on land, at sea, and in the air of South Korea under the deceptive signboard of Shield of Freemen is an extremely provocative and aggressive large-scale drill for actual war aimed at a sudden preemptive attack on North Korea. The gravity and the danger of the drill lie in the fact that it includes the application of O-Plan 2022, a war scenario simulating preemptive strikes against the nuclear facilities of North Korea. Additionally, Pyongyang tested 2 new types of air defense missiles. The large-scale annual war games conducted by the US and South Korea often cause a spike in tensions. North Korea typically responds with fiery rhetoric, missile tests, and reciprocal military drills. And so hopefully the war games end, tensions start to cool on the Korean peninsula, but you never know. The US has been moving military assets around, putting new military assets in the Korean peninsula. So I think there is some concern here that this might not simmer back down as it usually does after the war games end. All right. Moving on to Gaza, this article from JudgeNap.com on August 21st. Hamas agreed to ceasefire deal allowing Israel to maintain control over Egyptian border and buffer zones. So Dropsite News' Jeremy Scahill reported that Hamas has agreed to an Egyptian and Qatari ceasefire proposal that includes significant concessions, including allowing Israel to continue to occupy large areas of Gaza. According to the sources speaking with Scahill, Hamas agreed to allow Israel to retain control over the Philadelphia corridor or the Gaza-Egypt border. Under the proposal, Cairo and Tel Aviv will negotiate the withdrawal of Israeli forces at a later date. Additionally, Hamas is accepting Israeli buffer zones inside of Gaza. After October 7th, Hamas attack, Israel created buffer zones stretching from 800 meters to 1.5 kilometers into Gaza. Aside from the major territorial concessions, Hamas has also withdrawn its demand that Israel disband the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The GHF is the only aid agency Israel allows to distribute food in Gaza. GHF sites are far from population centers, forcing Palestinians to walk through areas where Israeli military is actively conducting operations to receive small amounts of food. Over 1,800 Palestinians have been killed at or near GHF sites. The high death toll for aid seekers has led to international human rights agencies to label the GHF as a tool of Israel's genocide. Israel has not responded to the Egyptian and Qatari deal that was accepted by Hamas. The Palestinian militant group is only offering to release half of the remaining hostages at the beginning of the ceasefire. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is demanding Hamas release all 50 remaining captives, and of course I think Hamas is very unlikely to do that, just based on the fact that Israel has walked back on and broken so many ceasefire deals with Hamas, and holding the hostages and agreeing to release them 6 weeks or 2 months down the line will pressure Netanyahu not to break the ceasefire deal. It'll add some incentive for Israel not just to get back their hostages and immediately resume the military operations against Hamas. Netanyahu says Israel to take over Gaza regardless of whether a deal is reached with Hamas. And so Netanyahu is saying that, boy, Hamas, you should really keep those hostages because we're going to break any deal that you make with us anyways, really making it impossible to get a deal done, I would imagine. All right, this is an important story. Israeli data shows at least 83% of Palestinians killed in Gaza are civilians. So this was reported by Yuval Abraham at 972 magazine, and he says he obtained IDF data that shows at least 83% of Palestinians killed by Israeli soldiers were civilians. And so he writes, assuming all the certain and probable militant deaths were counted in the death toll, that would mean that over 83% of Gaza's dead were civilians. If the probable deaths are discounted and only the certain deaths included, the proportion of civilian death raises to 86%. The IDF data also shows that most of the Palestinians labeled as militants and killed in Gaza were junior members of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and less than half the leadership has been killed. Abraham explains, according to the data, which was obtained in May of this year, the Israeli army believes it had killed around 8,900 operatives in Gaza since October 7th. The vast majority of them were junior, with the army suspecting that it killed between 100 and 300 senior Hamas operatives out of a total of 750 named in the database. At the time the IDF data on militant deaths was recorded, the Gaza Health Ministry reported at least 53,000 Palestinians have been killed. However, that number is considered an undercount, with some experts suggesting that the true death toll is well over 100,000. And so again, this 83 is the absolute floor. The number is probably far, far higher, meaning, for every member of Hamas that Israel kills, they're killing 20, 30 civilians. I mean, the slaughter of innocents is absolutely unmeasured and unfathomable. So the numbers from the IDF database are far lower than the figures presented by Israeli officials to the public. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu once claimed Israel killed 20,000 members of Hamas, which is clearly untrue at this point. Even the IDF data shows it. All right, this one, Bezalel Smotrich, one of the worst people in Israel, told the IDF chief that anyone who doesn't evacuate Gaza City can die of hunger or surrender. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has told the head of the Israeli military that anyone who remains in Gaza City after the IDF evacuation order can die of hunger or surrender. So this is what Smotrich told IDF Chief of Staff Zamir. We ordered you to carry out a quick operation. In my opinion, you can besiege them. Whoever doesn't evacuate, don't let them. No water, no electricity. They can die of hunger or surrender. This is what we want, and you're capable of doing it. And so just another example of an Israeli official reported by Israeli media making clearly genocidal comments, and hopefully one day somebody at The Hague will read that to Bezalel Smotrich as they sentence him to a very just prison sentence. This one, August 24th, JudgeNap.com. Famine officially declared in Gaza. So the UN-backed agency responsible for tracking and monitoring starvation declared parts of Gaza are now currently experiencing famine, and the full strip is expected to face catastrophic starvation in the coming weeks. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC, reported on Friday, as of August 15, 2025, famine is confirmed in Gaza. After 22 months of relentless conflict, over 500,000 people in the Gaza Strip are facing catastrophic conditions created by starvation, destruction, and death. Another 1.7 million people are in emergency, and almost 400,000 are in crisis. And so there's 5 stages: 1, which is normal; 2, which is getting concerning; 3, which is crisis; 4, which is emergency; and 5, which is famine. And so what they're saying, that 500,000 people are in famine. There are catastrophic conditions. 1 million people or 1.1 million people are in phase 4 emergency, and 400,000 people are just in crisis. And so that's like the best off people in Gaza are just facing a food crisis, not food emergency or food catastrophe. Now, they project, and this is the map on my article here, that by the time we are in late September of 2025, the entire strip will be in famine. So for the IPC to declare famine, strict conditions must be met. At least 20% of households face a complete lack of food. Acute malnutrition prevalence exceeds 30%, and mortality rates exceed 2 deaths per 10,000 per day. And so that would mean just huge number of Palestinians are starving to death, that we are now at this level of starvation in Gaza. Absolutely concerning and sickening. And also consider that, just those, the 30% that have to be in acute malnutrition, I mean, for children especially, these are going to lead to lifelong consequences. We're talking about generationally setting back the Palestinian people of Gaza with this starvation campaign. So the IPG expects the situation will worsen in the coming weeks. Between mid-August and the end of September of 2025, conditions are expected to further worsen, and famine is projected to expand to Deir al-Bala and Khan Yunis. Nearly a third of the population are expected to face catastrophic conditions. Acute malnutrition is projected to continue to worsen rapidly. Through June of 2026, at least 132,000 children under 5 are expected to suffer from acute malnutrition. I mean, I don't even know what to say to that. That's just horrific and unthinkable. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres blamed Israel for the starvation. This is not a mystery. It is a man-made disaster, a moral indictment, a failure of humanity itself. Famine is not only about food, it is about the deliberate collapse of the system needed for human survival. People are starving, children are dying, and those with the duty to act are failing. As the occupying power, Israel has the unequivocal obligation under international law, including the duty of ensuring food and medical supplies to the population. We cannot allow this situation to continue with impunity. A U.S.-backed Israeli siege has caused widespread starvation in Gaza. In March, Tel Aviv imposed a complete siege of the Strip, preventing all aid and commercial goods from entering Gaza. In late May, Israel began allowing the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to distribute a small amount of food. The GHF does not distribute enough food to feed the millions of people who are starving. The aid distribution sites are located far from population centers, forcing Palestinians to travel through combat zones to receive food. Over 1,800 Palestinian aid seekers have been killed en route to GHF sites, and of course Palestinians are also starving to death. As David explains here, 18 Palestinians starved to death in Gaza over 3 days due to the Israeli siege. And so this is from Friday to Sunday. Another 18 people starved to death. The total starvation officially recorded, of course the number is likely higher, is 289, including 115 children. Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, claims Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank are not illegal under international law. And so I interviewed Jeremy R. Hammond on the Kyle Anzalone show on Thursday, and we talked about settlement expansion a lot and the role it plays in the genocide of the Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, but also the apartheid system in the West Bank and Israel's plans to annex the West Bank. And so Mike Huckabee making this statement is giving Netanyahu more of a green light to move forward on annexing the West Bank, which I do think could definitely happen under the Trump administration. The Iranian Ayatollah says U.S. wants Iran to be obedient, but the situation cannot be resolved through negotiations. So the Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said on Sunday that the U.S. is seeking an obedient Iran, that the issues with the U.S. cannot be resolved through negotiations. They want Iran, with its great history and its people, with all their honor and glory, to obey the U.S. Those who argue, why don't you hold direct negotiation with America and resolve your issues? In my opinion, they are only seeing what is on the surface. This is not the essence of the matter. This matter cannot be resolved. And if that's the case, I do wonder if the Ayatollah is really considering developing nuclear weapons to prevent another U.S. and Israeli attack on the Islamic Republic. All right, wrapping up here on today's show, Israel bombs presidential palace in Sana'a, prepares for a large-scale war in Yemen. Israel conducted dozens of airstrikes in Yemen, including striking the presidential palace. Tel Aviv is collecting a large bank of targets for a widespread bombing campaign in Yemen. On Sunday, the IDF said more than 10 Israeli warplanes dropped 35 bombs in Yemen. Along with the presidential palace, Israel targeted 2 power plants. Officials in Tel Aviv said the strikes were in response to a missile fired by Ansar Allah, or the Houthis, at Israel on Friday. The IDF reports it was a new type of missile that contained submunitions. Ansar Allah, the group that has ruled most of Yemen since 2015, started a blockade of Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea in response to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Ansar Allah has expanded the operations to missile and drone strikes against Israel and U.S. warships in response to the U.S. and Israel bombing Yemen. Ansar Allah has maintained it would not end attacks on Israel or the blockade until Tel Aviv ends the onslaught in Gaza. Following the Israeli strikes, a Yemeni official explained that Ansar Allah will not retreat from it until the aggression has lifted, the siege is broken, and the starvation of Gaza's people is stopped. Walla, an Israeli outlet, reports that Tel Aviv is preparing for large-scale strikes against Yemen. So the outlet explained, a very large effort is underway by the intelligence and security services and the Mossad to build a broad target bank in order to strike the Houthis' center of gravity. Israeli politicians told Walla, we need to simultaneously hit their military intelligence systems, ports, military capabilities, and defense industry. From March to May, President Donald Trump ordered the military to attack Yemen to break the blockade of Israeli-linked shipping. Over 10 weeks, the U.S. dropped over 1,000 bombs on Yemen, killing hundreds of civilians. However, the strikes failed to break the blockade. Ansar Allah downed 7 U.S. drones and caused an F-18 to fall off an aircraft carrier. Trump then agreed to a truce with Ansar Allah in May to end the attacks on American warships in the Red Sea. The ceasefire did not expand to Israel. The Israeli officials argued to Walla that the Israeli strikes on Yemen must do more damage than the American operations. If necessary to accumulate many targets whose combined effects can cause very heavy damage, unlike the American operations that failed to defeat them. And so the U.S. operations did a ton of damage, and that Israel saying, oh, they didn't do any damage is very concerning that Israel is preparing to start a major bombing campaign of Yemen, which I would not be surprised if it drugged the Americans in, just like with Iran. Trump seems obedient to Netanyahu, and certainly a large-scale bombing campaign in Yemen as Israel is trying to, complete its ethnic cleansing of Gaza, operations in the West Bank, occupation of southern Lebanon and Syria, and maybe even a future potential conflict with Iran, maybe even in the coming months, then I think Israel would likely need significant U.S. support to bomb Yemen, whether that comes just through military intelligence support, bombs, maybe some refueling aircraft, things like that, but also maybe once again resuming U.S. strikes on Yemen. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. Hope you all have a good week. I will be back with an episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show. Dave DeCamp is the guest today, 4:45 Eastern Time. Subscribe to the show. Check it out. The Kyle Anzalone Show is the first top link in the show notes page. Very easy to find.